What's up YouTube? Nick here, and today we're going to talk about fantasy bird watching. Now before we get into it, I just want to say if you enjoy this video at all, please hit that like button and subscribe. It really goes a long way in helping with the YouTube algorithm, and I've really been putting on these videos in my spare time, and it would just be a huge favor, so thank you. Now to get into it, fantasy bird watching. That's right, like fantasy basketball or fantasy football, we now have fantasy bird watching. And I actually came across this through an article that my father sent me, so shout out to you, Dad. Here it goes. Now you can go fantasy bird watching by going to fantasybirding.com. You can make an account. It's actually really intuitive and quite easy to do. Once you're logged on, you actually have the opportunity to join some pre-existing leagues or create one of your own. But before we get into all that, what is a league and how does it all work? Well, essentially, fantasy birding just pulls tons of information off of ebird, which is a citizen science approach to gathering a lot of migratory bird data, but also just a place to put your bird checklists. It's put on by the Cornell lab of ornithology and has been a hugely beneficial tool for birders all over the place. And instead of selecting team players on a roster, you might put locations and then anticipated birds that you think will show up there the next day. You might say, okay, one area that I really enjoy birding is an area called Beaver Lake Bird Sanctuary. And I know that on any given day, there's definitely going to be cardinals, eastern towhees, and song sparrows there. So I can say, okay, well, I'm going to place a bet that they'll be there. If I go birding at that location tomorrow and sure enough I see them, I win. But not very big stuff. The way to really move up the ranks is to predict rarities. To understand that maybe there's a particular storm pattern going through and that a shorebird that might not normally be seen inland could possibly show up. It's those rarity predictions and being able to execute that really moves you up the ranks. Now, I'll be honest with you guys, there are a couple ways to game the system. eBird's not perfect, it's citizen science. And while there are moderators that review your checklist submissions and might say whether or not those birds would or would not be in that location, it's not perfect. There have been several times where I've submitted rarities on eBird and no one's ever questioned me, because it would make sense that around this time of the year that bird could potentially show up. And so, really, fantasy birding could be gamed a little bit. If you say that there's going to be a bird in one particular location and then you kind of just fib. Now, you're not getting anywhere for doing this. You're hurting the citizen science and the data that's being gathered from eBird, and you're just supporting a false win for yourself. But, it is sort of an obvious flaw of this fantasy birding is that it really relies on user-submitted data, and users have a personal interest in rising the ranks and becoming the best fantasy birder. The other thing to mention is that no, there's no cash prize at the end. Unfortunately, it's a really fun project and initiative that a different birder was able to put together in his spare time, and there's really no gambling involved. It's just for the enjoyment of birding and having the opportunity to maybe do a little bit of armchair birding, fantasizing about what might show up at a location far away from you and seeing if you're right. One thing that I was actually really surprised and interested to see was that they put together a March Madness for birding. I just thought that was great and topical, and they pulled together a lot of the top fantasy birders and each competed them against each other to see who could see the most birds each day. Now, what was a little interesting is that it was not the most bird species, but just the total volume of birds. I mean, total advantage for the people on the coast. You can get just large flocks of birds flying in and count 200 or 300 there in the moment, but really a fun spin and an interesting way to take on it. If this is something that's maybe piquing your interest, or maybe you want to start a fantasy bird league with me, I'd be happy to join. You can find a link down below and register your account. It's really simple, very intuitive. One of the greatest features of this website is that it will mimic a global big year or a North American big year. Now, you're able to do a big year on fantasy birding by selecting one particular location each day and selecting the birds that you believe will show up there. I haven't started mine yet because unfortunately I'm a bit behind the 8 ball. We're curving into April now and I still haven't really begun, and so I don't think I've got much of a fighting chance, but it'll definitely be something that's on my radar for next year. I guess the real question is if I feel like this is just a novelty or has some staying power, and I really feel like it probably nestles somewhere in between. The reason I went to the website in the first place was because of the novel fact of having some fantasy birding. I thought that was really hilarious and ingenious. But is it something that I think that I'll use every day? Well, I'm really in the habit of using ebird when I'm out birding, and if this is really just pulling a lot of that data, I could see it actually becoming something that I would use. For the time being, I've only tinkered with it during a few runs, and I'll have to let you guys know in the future if it's something I've kept up with. But sound off in the comments. Does this seem like something you guys would be interested in doing? Did you grow up playing fantasy sports and have been since looking for the birding comparison? Let me know what you think down below, and again, please hit that like button if you enjoyed this video. I really appreciate you guys watching. You can find me on Instagram at stopandlisten.channel. Thanks, guys.